working with cyclical publishing has been a real joy in my life. Just a quick story around that. I remember I was going out to the woods to finish this book, and Brendan knew I was going out to the woods to finish this book. And Brendan literally called me and said, "Hey, wanted you to know that I'm praying for you and that we care about you, and we anticipate the work you're about to do." And I'll tell you what never happened with, no offense, InterVarsity Press. Any IVP people here, sorry. But that kind of care was really important to me, and I found very valuable in the writing process. So again, thank you for being here. And I have like probably 15-20 minutes of pontifications for you all, and then from there we'll do some breakout groups to kind of work through some of the material together, and we'll come back. And I hope there's some toasts and some cheers and some joy and some celebration around this, and the hope for what new churches can mean, especially in this unique time as we move through COVID and we reconfigure what it means to be the church today. So that said, nothing fancy here. I'd love to talk with this size of a group. I think, if you all have any questions while I'm talking, just speak up, and I would love to talk with you as we do this. But yeah, let's plan on about 1:20. We'll break out and start to think about the material together. Make sense? Great. All right, let's go. Let's do it. So there are many church starting books. You all have probably read many of the church starting books. And I've been fortunate to write in a bunch of the church starting books. And when we came up with this new project, I thought, okay, what can progress this thing forward as we think about new churches in today's year. So the two main frames that stood out to me were, how can we encourage a post-industrial perspective on church starting, and how can we encourage a post-colonial perspective on church starting? So let's start with post-industrial. Many of you probably as well, or better than me, know the equations. When I started the first church that I started, I was literally given an equation for how to start a church. And equations can be helpful to a point, but what I found, as I've been fortunate enough to work with a whole bunch of people who are starting new churches, is that equations oftentimes leave out the Holy Spirit. And that was very dissatisfactory to me. I worked with person after person who were dead set on following the A plus B plus C, and boom, you get a church. And I just wanted to call that out. I wanted to call that out, that we were making idols of equations that we'd been given, and that in the name of idols, we were leaving out God's particular presence in the midst of our communities for what was contextually happening with God through the equation. So that's where post-industrial comes. Brendan and I spent many hours talking about the title and subtitle of this book. And there's many jokes to be had about the title and subtitle of this book. We ended up going with a really poppy title, Deconstructing Church Planting. That was like iteration number 62 that we ended up landing on. And then we went with a super academic subtitle. I think the subtitle is Reconstructing a Post-Industrial and Post-Colonial Pneumatology for the Next Generation of Churches. And I found that subtitle to be kind of a joke and sort of obnoxious, but also extremely accurate. So that's really kind of what this book is. It is a post-colonial and post-industrial pneumatology for the next generation of churches. So to the post-industrial end, God bless our siblings in Christ who have developed protocols and equations to scale church starting efforts. And there's been moments in time, which is named in the book, where that has been quote unquote effective for the furthering of the church. But again, at the heart of it all, I've just felt very dissatisfied with the equation over and against the Holy Spirit. So that's the heart of post-industrial. Post-colonial, Brendan and I were just talking yesterday. I wrote 2 chapters in this book called Sent to Flourish, which was an IVP publication about church planting. And this book was the result of one of the chapters that was written in that book. I had to go to University Press and talk with them if it was appropriate to take the frames, I think it was chapter 10, and turn it into a whole book. The editors of that book, Charles Clotherman, Len Tang, and then Scott Sundquist was also a big contributor to that, said, no problem, that sounds good, go for it. And that's where this book resulted from. Brendan and I's conversation was around the first chapter in Sent to Flourish, which was really tied to the westward movement in the United States as a church planting movement. And I appreciated Dr. Sundquist's work there. No one had done that work yet. And it compared and contrasted the Puritans as they moved west versus the Episcopalians as they moved west versus the Methodists as they'd moved west. But the commonality that I found in the midst of that story that I think just needs to be named is that all of them were colonial processes, whether it be the Methodists and their big tent revivals to orient people to the culture of Methodism, or it be the Catholics and their work in moving west, and which is a big part. So I live in Los Angeles, California, and a big to do in California is to go see the missions in California. Right, there's several of them, and you can go see the missions and kind of where the Catholics set up camp. But what happened in those missions, just to be realistic, is that they set up camp and they worked with indigenous people to culturize them into what it meant to be a Spanish Catholic. And I think that's tricky and difficult. And, this particularly smart group could have a very insightful conversation around that. But when I tie some work we did in starting missional churches, which is the first book I did in 2014, there's a real neglect toward treating neighbors as mutual subjects. So I think it would be wise of us to note that when we work with our neighbors, particularly our neighbors who don't identify as Christian, that our neighbors should be honored in trusting that God is at work in their lives. And the problem with some of the colonial moves, just for this specific incident, with the missions in mind, the missions weren't honoring that God is on the move with indigenous people. And that creates a problem because there isn't a mutual learning going on there. And so instead, indigenous people are culturized and forced into a certain perspective on how to live life and what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, rather than noting there's lots to learn in mutual relationship. And on top of it, lots of fun, lots of joy to be had, and lots of good challenges where iron can sharpen iron and people can become better humans. So that's the big picture frame, I think, on why this book is important. The post-colonial components of it and the post-industrial components of it. Does that make sense? Are there any thoughts, questions there? Anyone want to throw anything in? All right, I'll keep driving forward. Let's go here. So full disclosure, I was pre-med student undergrad and ended up getting a biology degree. And that biology degree really impacts the way that I think about life and how life grows and dies and multiplies or doesn't multiply. And in the book early on, I noticed a trend that I just named in the book, and I named it the 4 phases in the season of birth. So most everything that has ever been born goes through these 4 phases. The first phase is obviously the phase of birth. The second phase then is moving from birth toward homeostasis. So there's this moment where we grow up as organisms. Ultimately, we move from not being able to reproduce to being able to reproduce. The third phase or season, depending, some of the language is actually real tricky in this book. We had to work a lot on it. So I'll call these seasons just for now. But the third season is that season of homeostasis. And I would argue that from a biological perspective and from an ecclesial perspective, that homeostasis exists to maximize the opportunities of reproduction. And then the fourth season is the exit of homeostasis eventually into death. So tie those 4 seasons of life: birth, movement toward homeostasis, homeostasis, and then exit homeostasis and death, to the church. And the natural question that stands out to me is, what do churches do when they are in homeostasis? In this book, as you may or may not have read yet, I would argue that the ratio of reproductive habits within homeostasis is far too small, and that has led to the decline specifically of the church in the Western Hemisphere. So there you go, 4 seasons of life. And then this book specifically focuses on that first season, that season of birth. And I named 4 phases in the season of birth. There is firstly the season of discernment, specifically for the church. How do we discern that a new church is being invited to be born? And I think a shtick in this book that's important to note here is the discernment for both point leaders and for parishioners. Many of you have started churches. I know many of you, and there's a lot of emphasis for a point leader or a set of point leaders to discern whether or not they are called to start a church. And that is great. Hallelujah. Thanks be to God. That's lovely. I also in this book want to name that season of discernment for people who are going to become the beloved community together. They also need an active season of discernment for discerning whether or not they are being called by God to start this new church. The second season within, get this right, Brendan, this is where we had lots of talks here. The second phase within the season of birth is the season of initial organization. And that's when people begin to gather together to pray about where they're going to join God. What are they being invited into by the Holy Spirit? How is God inviting them to activate their agency, which has been empowered and equipped by God, to move into the world and to be a witness for Jesus? That's season 2. Season 1, season of discernment. Season 2, the season of the initial organized gathering. Season 3 is the season of the initial public witness. This is when the church says, all right, here we are, to the neighborhood, to the community, to the city. Here we are. I think there's an interesting piece here that I named in that chapter, and that's that we only get one shot at first impressions. So we get one shot with multiple people and with multiple groups of people at the first impression, but how can we do well with that first impression? And an antithesis story here is a church I worked with down on Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles. They had their one shot at their first impression with the entirety of the city. They joined the city like a good church would do in a beach cleanup. They did lovely, getting their people there. They're all there with their rakes and their trash bags, cleaning up the trash on the beach. And you know what? They picked up thousands of water bottles, empty water bottles, single-use plastic water bottles. Great move. Everyone's happy. Everyone enjoys it. You know, the problem with their first impression is that, you want to guess what they handed out during this first impression to the city? They handed out single-use plastic water bottles to every volunteer that was there with their church branding on it. That, my friends, was a problem. And that resulted in uh, I'll say it succinctly, like a sequence of events that made the church laughable to the community, and the church never got off the ground. So that first impression is important as we go into the season of initial public witness, and we need to do well with them. Also, let's be honest, we all mess up. So we need to be graceful with each other, but if at least we can be wise, that would be helpful. And then the fourth phase within the season of birth is the season of adapting initial public witness. So here we're talking about change cycles, firstly, and we're talking about clarity on how decisions are made. So depending on what tradition you're in, depending on how you're doing your ecclesiology, can we please just have clarity on how decisions are made? And secondarily, there's unending change cycles that exist within the church. I think I quoted in the book, I think I quoted Roxborough, his change cycle. Scott Cormode in his book, The Innovative Church, has a lovely change cycle. Human design is a change cycle that I've used and that we use with encyclical. So please just note your change cycle, note how you're going to do adaptations as a community, and then note how those adaptations are going to be decided upon and how they're actually going to be changed. So there you go. 4 seasons of life: birth, movement toward homeostasis, homeostasis to maximize reproduction, and then exit homeostasis and death. This book is focusing on the first season of life, which is birth. And there are 4 phases in that: season of discernment, initial organization, initial public witness, and adapting the initial public witness. Anyone want to throw anything in here before I move on to the next section?
It looked like Alice had a question here. How do you establish mutuality in the face of the expectations of leadership? How do you overcome the barrier to connection that is inherent in the expectation that churches take a prescriptive approach? Run for the hills. So yeah, about reciprocity, mutuality, leadership.
I'm so fortunate to get to hang out with the president of Cyclical all the time. His name is Henry Artime. He is a successful business entrepreneur, and he is the hallmark of humility. I love being around this man because he is quick to note what a schmuck he is. And that is actually very encouraging to me as he takes this posture of understanding that he's going to be broken in whatever he is sharing. Probably this is, on the topic of reciprocity, the framework we've set in the past is creating neighbors as mutual subjects, participating with neighbors as mutual subjects. A humble posture there seems to make sense to me. Understand that I'm a sinner, I mess up, and that God is active in my life, and that our neighbors as well are sinners, and God is also active in their life. So how do we create a reciprocal / mutual relationship to find where God is active amongst us, and then ride that flow as we move forward? Did I answer the question? I mean,
the first part, I think. The other part is sort of when you're meeting people, and they have a lot of reticence maybe for being involved or anything. Like if they know you're a church or you're trying to be church together, sometimes people are sort of unwilling to engage, I guess, just because they assume you're going to be prescriptive. So I guess, how do you communicate that well enough? I'm just kind of struggling with how that works.
That's a great question. Well, I'm working with a church right now in Los Angeles that is literally removing the name church from their name so that they can actually be the church. And they've done that, and the results have been fantastic. So that's a whole rabbit trail we don't need to get down into. And definitely I'm not prescribing that. But I'm a Young Life kid at heart. I heard about Jesus at a Young Life camp. Those of you familiar with that parachurch ministry, and love or hate Young Life, and I have both in that. At the heart of Young Life is a priority on relationships, and you all get this. I mean, Alice, you get this, and the necessary and hard work, and also the joy of relationships. I wonder how building trust through actively mutual relationships can engage that. And then I would assume, Alice, that you're doing that as well. So then the question becomes, if we're building active mutual relationships and that framework of church is still too much to get over for people to participate, I'm wondering the article that needs to be written for what needs to happen there missiologically in order for the kind of movement that you want to see happen to happen.
Nick, do you want to send us out into breakout rooms? I mean, I have them all drawn up, but if you have some questions for discussion.
I want to bring in Josh here real quick, if we can do
great.
that.
And Daniel's here too as well.
Oh, whatever, Daniel. No, thank you, Daniel, for being here. Thank you, Josh, for being here. I'm wondering if you might know one or two pieces of the frames from this book that were impactful for you to name in the midst of the creation of your churches. So Josh created the Restoration Project in Virginia, which was the rural church planting story that we noted in this book. And Daniel was a part of creating Anchor City Church, which was the suburban narrative in this book. Could you all throw in a piece or two here?
Can you just reiterate what you're looking for here, Nick? Any of the four seasons, just hit on some of those?
Yeah, a frame that was helpful for you to name, that you intuitively did as a church, but was helpful to name, that might be helpful for other church starters here.
I just know what that entire second phase of the initial gathering, our church was being born, phase 2 and phase 3 sort of became the same thing. We just started meeting as a Bible study, which was functionally our first public gathering. So in that, we made huge mistakes in sort of stumbling into all of it at once and not knowing how to invite people into whatever it was that we were creating, because we didn't really have a good understanding of what we were trying to create. And I think that our story is going to be pretty rare in that sense. In the age of a lot of people putting intentionality into preview services and first impressions, like you're telling that story of the church and their first impression. I don't even know when ours would have been, because we just sort of became a thing, which the pro to that was a lot of organic relationships were being built. There was a lot of excitement around that, but we missed out on a lot of opportunities to meet people and to let them know what we were doing, because we didn't ourselves know what we were doing. So I was thumbing through and reading back through some of the things I had written and reading some other sections, and it was helpful even now. Like, we're 9 years in, Nick, and the stuff that you're talking about, it's like, oh, I need to go back and even keep doing some of this work of enunciating with clarity who we are and what we're doing, and bringing people in. The other piece of that I'll say, and then I'll let Daniel talk. I struggle with insecurity and self-doubt, and for church starters, that's not usually the model.
No Enneagram 3 ENFP for you?
Well, I have no idea what Enneagram I am, Nick, but that can be a different Zoom chat for us at a different point. But being able to get over some of those barriers and being excited about the work, whatever it looks like. Because for some people, it's not going to be a preview service with 500 people. It's going to be like our story, 13 people in fold-out chairs in your buddy's living room. But God shows up in those living rooms and can create something that is really incredible, even if that defies what the surrounding culture would say a successful church plant is. I mean, we're still pretty small. And I love that bit in the early chapters of the book when you said, when somebody asks you how many people you have, you're like, well, we're about 100, but I wish that, what was the second half of that line? Like, I wish we were
It's way too
smaller.
big. It's way
Yeah,
too
yeah.
big. We should be starting way more churches. We're
Yeah,
home
and just like turning things like that on their heads was so important for me, and it's something I'm still wrestling with and still learning, because those cultural moves of what success is just live sort of in my brain space most days. So it's always good to remind myself that God is working through the small and through the good relationships that are being built, and the continual process of figuring out who you are and what you're doing in the world.
If you haven't read Josh's chapter yet, I'm going to brag on you, Josh, for a second. Josh is a PhD student, and this guy knows how to write. And on top of it, he's funny. So I remember reading your chapter for the first time and just laughing my tail off. So thanks for including some levity and some humor in your chapter, and for articulating so well. Daniel, how about you? Anything stand out from Anchor City Church?
Yeah, I mean, even reflecting on Alice's question, I think when we're working in a broader cultural environment, both in the church and outside of the church, that values that industrialized version of cranking out more and more widgets faster and faster, regardless of the human toll, it's a lot for us to try to shift models. And I mean, how many times in the church world have we encountered we value the genius with 1,000 helpers, but if we're talking about deconstructing those models, it takes time. And that's not only winning and earning the trust of people who rightfully are cynical and skeptical of the church, but even internal work that we need to do as leaders to pick apart some of those voices that tell us we can and cannot do certain things. We are or are not a success or failure based on certain productivity metrics. That's a lot to untangle. And I think all of us kind of find ourselves in that. I mean, as we were kind of sharing this story of our narrative of starting Anchor City Church, my very first informal church planting assessment was, you're totally not a fit. And my gut reaction was relief, because I thought, okay, good. I can just have an ordinary, boring church career and it'll be so easy. And here I am 10 years later, fully in the thick of it. And I love it, you know, for all the ups and downs. I think about that season of initial public expression and blending into adaptation. That season, we're still very much in. One of the ways that we not only empowered folks from our church, but we just found a lot of life was through our Sunday school. Practically speaking, we were too small to hire a children's minister. And so we said right off the bat, we're going to need parents, we're going to need caring adults to get involved. And because we were dealing with a lot of folks who were either unchurched or had not been a part of a church in a long, long time, there was a lot of discomfort on their end. I don't know anything about the Bible. What if they ask me about dinosaurs? I mean, all the typical kind of Sunday school stuff. And so one of the best things we did as pastors, my wife and I, is we would meet with volunteers who were going to teach Sunday school. And we would just get to know them better and ask them, even apart from specific Bible things, what do you like? What gives you life? What are you passionate about? What's fun to you that you would want to convey to the kids in our church? And yeah, we're just a small family church anyway, so they all know each other. All the men are uncle, all the women are aunties. And so we're just trying to lower some of the barriers of fear. And what we discovered was we have a really talented and passionate bunch. So one of the members of our church is a photographer, and we built a 1 month sort of curriculum with him around photography principles. So light and dark, framing. What does it mean for the kids to make pinhole cameras and do a gallery show? And we explored those themes in scripture of light and dark and perspective and all those things. And we're really able to, I think the kids had fun, but the best result for us was that our adult volunteer, he came back and said, I had no idea I could do that. I had no idea that this was in me. Since then, since the pandemic, I mean, we've had tons and tons of adjustments in how we're trying to do that. So that is a nonstop sort of adaptation for us. But it was good to reflect on the ways that we wanted to build a community together, so that it wasn't just religious professionals doing the work and people were sitting passively receiving the goods and services we were offering, but that they were invited to be a part of building an open-ended thing. It was going to become whatever it was going to become. So that, again, those are the conversations that we, just like all of you have dealt with. Our city is very transitional. So we've had handfuls of founding families and really critical families leave the area because it's too expensive. Work sent them away, studies sent them away. And so that continual process of meeting folks, getting to know them, earning trust, empowering them to do things that they didn't think were possible, we're right in that mix alongside each of you still too.
Thank you, Daniel. I actually just was trying to edit my chat box to everyone, not trying to send it out to finish, to say, Daniel, time to wrap it up, land that plane, buddy. So I didn't mean to enter there. I meant to edit. Daniel and Jaya wrote their chapter and really came through on a beautiful narrative from a suburban church. Dr. Reverend Najma Smith Pollard is on an airplane right now, flying back from somewhere. She was going to actually try and come in from the airplane, which I thought would have been awesome, but she couldn't do it. So there are some small group questions for you there. You all come from different social locations and where you're at with your ecclesiologies as well, when you're at with the church. So just find a question, adapt the question as you see fit, and let's come back here in 15 minutes at 1:50, and we'll do a final Q&A and a toast, and we'll move about our day. Does that sound good?
Hi, I'm Paul. Well, welcome back, everybody. Nick, do you have an idea of how you'd like this time to come, or would you like me to lead this?
No preference. Happy to answer questions. Happy to hear other people's thoughts.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think in the last couple minutes, let's just take 5 minutes. If someone had something from their group, really want to avoid regurgitating the thing you said. But if there's something that you heard someone else say that you want to make sure was brought back to the group that you thought was especially poignant or reflection worthy, invite you to unmute yourself and be bold and speak that up. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, invite you to use the chat function as well. What's something you heard in your group that you thought was noteworthy?
It's just always good to hear other people's stories, and sometimes in the busyness of church life, those relationships get we don't feel an opportunity for them, but they're so life-giving. So I would just encourage people, myself included, to find your folks and hear what's happening outside your world to inspire the things that are happening in your world.
I mean, on a side note here, we got to be immersed in Beth's story, which is fantastic Episcopal context north of San Antonio, enduring through COVID despite protocols pressed upon her by the Episcopal Church. Fantastic what we landed on, and not to be promoting here for Daniel at all, but Daniel did just start Cyclical Online, which is like a catch-all for people who are in cities where there's not cyclical networks. And yeah, anyone wants to jump in on that stuff with Daniel's leadership, just to experience the mutuality that happens through these narratives. Just privately DM Daniel right now.
Excellent, thanks. Who else has something noteworthy to share from your group? Something someone else said that you've been thought was remarkable?
I appreciate what Beth shared about taking 6 months to literally drive the streets in a city, street by street, and just praying that God would give her a sense of, I think the term you used, Beth, were the hot spots, where there could be opportunity, and just taking the time to allow the Holy Spirit to guide you in that process of making this shift from one community to another. I really appreciated that.
Sounds like Beth's touching on it too. That, I mean, the obvious risk in that is to put on your red cape and to be the superhero that's going to go save all the people that are in trouble. But it sounds like Beth's tending well to, instead of like going to be the hero that meets the needs, instead looking for where God is on the move and joining up with that. I think it's a much better frame long term.
I think I wish we had a bit more time to hear some more of the stories, but Sandra shared that she started something several years ago, and then the initial church plant idea got derailed due to her husband's an accident and then eventual death, and then how after several years she was able to kind of restart that. So that's interesting that I guess what impressed me was, I guess, the courage to not only start initially, but to set it aside and then to restart. That was very courageous.
The resiliency is on point with Sandra. Her resiliency has been really great. Angela Duckworth wrote that book called Grit. Many of you know where passion and perseverance intersect. Lots of church starters with lots of passion, but missing that perseverance piece. Sandra has been exemplary in her perseverance.
I want to highlight Matt's question. He said, he wrote this in the chat, lots of existing churches don't feel like they're at all in a stable homeostasis. Can they still figure out reproduction? What steps, best practices? So does one come before the other? What is homeostasis? How do you know if you're in homeostasis? All those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, homeostasis is both relative and dynamic, right? So I think Matt's question is a good one. I have a biased opinion on this, and that biased opinion is taken from biology. And what I look at the dying cactus out in my front yard right now. That cactus is dying. It's gonna be dead. I planted it on the corner front of my house. I planted it thinking it would be beautiful. It's quite frankly the ugliest corner on our entire block. I don't know what I was thinking in the first place. It is so ugly. So whatever, it's dying, but it is what it is. But as it's dying, you know what it's doing? It is not putting energy into trying to grow again. It is not putting energy into trying to get green. It is putting energy into trying to do one last flower to try and reproduce one more time. So you can take examples from biology on this, and they're not universal. Like those 4 seasons of life are fairly universal for most multicellular organisms. Well, there's unending narratives of what organisms do, especially specifically plants, as they're in their final stages, and a lot of them do a lot of work at creating flowers in order that they might reproduce. Again, fully biased.
We've got just a couple more minutes left.
I think there's a parallel there from a Canadian writer, the one who wrote Mother Tree, about like dying trees and how they help create like kind of the healthy environment for the soil for future for new growth to happen. So there's something about like that death and nurturing, creating the helping kind of recreate the environment for future growth to happen. I'm always plugging the Canadian. She was mentioned in Ted Lasso as well. So
I love it. So that This is another book to be written, but that fourth season of life, the season of exiting homeostasis and death, how we do as the church with that fourth season is the primary indicator for the next 50 years of church. If we do not do well with helping churches to end their life cycles, we're going to continue to have a difficult time in society and culture. If we do better with that, there's unending opportunities for the Easter narrative, what you just named, Paul, for resurrection.
Nick, are there good examples of churches that have done that?
There are. And again, I mean, God, I hate to be salesy here, but we just started Cyclical Full Circle. And this is exactly the reason we started that. So I would invite you to look at cyclicalfullcircle.com. Our whole team's put a year of work into launching this ministry, which is exactly around this thing, because we feel like this is so important.
Matt, I would also throw in there, part of the figuring out reproduction in an established church that's maybe struggling is framing it in a way that they see even taking any risk at all is a big win. And that, again, that's kind of a gut level thing. Like, how do you convince someone, not just on paper? We've done the same thing for decades and we've proven that this doesn't work. So then changing directions itself, regardless of the outcomes, that's a positive step in the right direction. I mean, there is research that suggests starting new churches is a step towards health for established churches. But again, it's just ink on paper if it doesn't connect at that kind of heart level with local leaders and elders or a board who wants to get behind it. So I think that's the role of folks in this sort of new church world and faithful innovation world, that we see the value in risk taking and not just reinforcing the status quo by, I've had this conversation over and over here locally, in the interest of, sort of mitigating risk, of not putting ourselves, in danger of lawsuits for properties and all this kind of stuff. It just reinforces that we're going to do the same thing over and over. And we know for certain that doesn't work. And so even one small step out of that, if you could be a voice, or someone can be a voice to identify that and to reframe even that small portion, maybe that's a spark that can help something else come out of that. And also to be a voice of realism. If you think there's a magic bullet program that's going to get 35 young families to your door, sign us all up. I mean, if someone invented that, then someone would have done it already. So it's really being grounded in the local context and understanding how powerful it is to even take steps towards change. To me, that's a big win.
Well, it's 5:01 where I am in my time zone. It might be 2:01 in your time zone or some other time zone, but our hour's up. So I just want to thank all of you for joining. Nick and I both are just so grateful for this time to connect. I think this is what it's about. You can read a book, but ultimately we want to be able to have relationships with other people, connections with other people who remind us that we're not alone in this journey. So I also want to offer, there's a link at the bottom of the chat here. There is all at the end of each chapter, Nick has included these great discussion questions. And this is our efforts to put all those questions in one space that you could even share with your team. So you could copy that link and share that link with a church starting team if you want to continue your discernment process, or whatever phase or season you're in. That can be a good starting point. It doesn't cost anything, and it's a good introduction into the book. So I just want to invite that. But I don't have a drink with me, but I'll raise my pen. And as a toast to Nick and the great work he's done, and also to the church starters, the contributing authors who have been part of this work and framing this out and paving a new way forward for the future of the church. So to all of you. And everybody else, go with God's peace and blessing. Thank you for being part of this, and hope to connect with you again soon. Bye.